I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is oral storytelling in its platonic form. One story written by one guy and then recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD is serialized, but you can absolutely start with this episode. It'll get you hooked immediately. And then you can dive into all the previous episodes or head over to Amazon, where you can pick up the SKALD prose collections. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 71. Ho was on the hunt. He was in pursuit of the Vermin Prince, chasing down any leads on that mysterious figure. He was searching for a way to perform his duty in the quickest, safest, most expedient manner. But more than anything, he was on the hunt for a drink. His pockets still jingled with coin, though they were not as full as they had been previously. That monstrous black cat beast had waited outside, impatiently, filling the darkened streets with its importunate mewling, unnatural noises that made the beast sound as if it was struggling to cry out in a human language. And as it waited, as it scared potential patrons away from that Ravenna tavern, Ho had made good on his promise to the tavern's existing customers, returning with the thuggish mercenaries' money and proceeding to buy 1, 2 more rounds than he could even count. He had spent more than he would have liked, had wasted money on the intoxication of those he did not even know, some of whom he did not even like. But it was nothing to be concerned about. After all, drinking alone is a consolation. But drinking with others, even those you don't care for, especially those you don't care for, is a celebration. But that had been hours ago, before the cat had burst into the tavern looking for him, interrupting his celebration. Before it had guided him to the towering obelisk at the center of town, before it chased him up those endless stairs, nipping at his ankles whenever he lagged, and before he was left with no other choice, before he had to comply with the lady's wishes, to obey Calarius' commands, and set out in search of this Vermin Prince. Ho had heard of the man, and the circles he traveled in, the bars he drank in, the alleys he collapsed in, taken by his nightly drunken stupor. How could he have not? But Ho was old enough that the Vermin Prince was far from the first boogeyman that he had heard of, far from the first vague horror that mothers used on their children, that rulers used on their populace, all to keep them scared, to keep them worried, to keep them compliant. And if one was looking for rumors, for myths, for tall tales, for outlandish conspiracies, there was no better place to begin the search than in a place where drinking occurred. The heavier, the better. So Ho had set off at a determined pace, with just the place in mind, a tavern far less well appointed than where he had been so rudely threatened by that mercenary, a tavern at the bottom of Ravena's social ladder, one where no one wished to end up, but far too many often did. This nameless hole, this squalid taproom, this was where he would begin his search, where he would continue his hunt. After he had a well-deserved drink. Before stumbling through the door, he had already affected a certain level of drunkenness. He'd frequented this establishment before, and he knew that the best way to fit in was to be as besotted as its regular patrons. And if, as in his current circumstances, that was impossible without a trip to the bar, then he figured it was wise to at least appear that drunk. But as soon as he entered that loud, smoky, mirth-filled tavern, he realized that he had far underestimated its clientele. Quickly, before anyone could notice that his drunkenness was decidedly below the tavern's average, he let his eyes go out of focus, he dragged his feet, and he swayed side to side as he began to slur the words of a song he only half remembered. The scent of wine was on the air, and he could feel the coins in his pocket growing hot against his leg. He needed a drink, and he needed it fast, needed to descend into the ecstasy of intoxication, needed to abandon his charade drunkenness in favor of the real thing. And so, bumping into more than a few patrons along the way, he shouldered his way up to the bar, carving out a spot for himself, secure in the knowledge that those customers so desperate for a drink that they bellied up to the bar, that they had far more pressing concerns on their mind than a rude, oblivious, painfully drunk old man. "Wine! Quickly!" He threw his head back, and he shouted at no one in particular. "Can't you see I'm dying of thirst?" A young barmaid, too pretty for that place, but too poor and lowborn for anywhere else. She smiled and brought over a simple brass goblet filled with red wine. She held it in her hand, back behind the bar, refusing to set it down. But even from that distance, Ho could smell how cheap and how strong it was, probably intensified with some foul, unnamed spirits. "You have the coin to pay for this, Grandpa?" The answer, of course, was yes. Not only did Ho have Gonith's coins filling his pockets, but he also had Calaria's coins held within a worn leather pouch tucked into his squalid breeches. His life was Calaria's to command, of course. After all, she had purchased a debt that he had no way to repay. But as he had explained to her at length, such an intensive search as the one for the Vermin Prince would likely carry with it certain expenses. So Ho had coin. He had much coin, more coin than he had possessed in ages. So he screwed up his face and then smiled at the barmaid. "I do not. But charity is a virtue. The girl scowled. There's no virtue to be found here, old man. She began to turn away, to strike some other poor fool blind with that potent, caustic concoction. But Ho stopped her. Wait. My good looks aren't the only thing that I have for you. And as the barmaid watched, disgusted, Ho began to dig in his filthy breeches for an uncomfortably long time. Ho had enough coin to buy whatever he wanted. Had enough coin to buy a round of whatever he wanted for the entire tavern, multiple rounds. But he was smarter than that. Far smarter than that. Why spend the coin when he didn't have to? When he could save it for a time when he couldn't finagle himself a drink without it? No. He wouldn't give the barmaid his precious coins. He dug into his breeches, knowing exactly what he would give the girl. And he started to chuckle as he found it, as he laid his hands upon it. The pendant. The girl's eyes softened from disgust to curiosity to intrigue and, finally, to covetous envy as she gazed upon that long platinum chain and the bejeweled gold pendant suspended from it, encrusted with diamonds and polished so heavily that it seemed to emit a light of its own inside that murky tavern. Caleria had given it to him, had condemned him to hold on to it under the pretense of protection, claiming that her ability to keep tabs on him was for his own safety. The very thought of it was absurd. He was Master Ho, the creator of the exquisite 8-arm technique. What help could her proctors be to one such as him? If he needed their assistance, the trouble would be far, far beyond anything they could deal with. And so, he decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to kill 2 birds with 1 pendant, and he traded the bauble for 4 glasses of wine, which he demanded be served to him all at once, slaking his thirst and ridding himself of Caleria's watchful eye in one fell swoop. Sooner or later, Caleria would send proctors looking for him. She'd understand if he spent too long in a tavern, but once the pendant and the girl that held it scuttled off to whatever hovel she made her home in, the lady would get suspicious. Ho chuckled to himself, and he quaffed his first glass of wine. That would be a problem for another day. 4 glasses of wine down, and Ho was feeling tipsy. But he was still far, far, far from intoxicated, far from the ecstasy that he wished to fall into. He was familiar enough with that blissful state to know just how to fake it, how to feign drunkenness, how to convince all those present that he was just as drunk, just as rowdy, just as incapable of falsehood as they were, having fallen under the potent spell of truth that affects all those with a mind full of thoughts and a belly full of alcohol. Ho had come to the sad, forsaken, filthy tavern in hopes of finding that mysterious mysterious savior of the downtrodden, that messiah of the forgotten. And to do that, he would need to speak their language, to let out an irresistible clarion call. He would need to let everyone in the bar know that he was one of them, that he was a fellow traveler, as fed up with the state of Ravenna as all those that felt its boot upon their neck. He would have to speak ill of his master, of the woman who had purchased his debt and sent him on this very mission. He would have to speak ill of Caleria herself. But while he had to fake being drunk, he did not have to fake speaking truthfully.
Do you know who I am? No.
Ho purposefully slurred his speech as he shouted down the bar at no one in particular.
No. Do you know who I used to be? Before the Lady of Ravenna, that witch, before she ruined it? Before she ruined everything?
He chugged another glass of wine and slammed the goblet down upon the bar.
I was Master Ho.
And he began to speak. No one was listening. Everyone in the tavern heard, and how could they not? But none of them actually listened as he spoke beatifically about the wonders of his 8-armed technique, about the distracting strike and the mercy blow. But he didn't mind. It felt good to talk about those halcyon days, the years in which he was able to pursue his art, held up by and shielded with freedom and security. And besides, that portion of his speech was just an appetizer. The main course was what came next. The tale of how Caleria, jealous of his students, just as all the other masters were as well, how she had conscripted his students because she was unable to train her proctors to be even half as effective. He spoke with passion, with bile, and with venom, with a bitterness that cut through his drunken speech, adding a caustic bite to every word that came out of his mouth. And as he did so, that bitterness, that simmering resentment, it infected the tavern patrons around them. It slid in through their ears, found similar feelings within them, and it stoked them, fanning the flames of their discontent. He told his entire sad tale, omitting his dealings with Yardoun, of course. There was no need to complicate things, to weaken the central message, the one that everyone there understood, the one that everyone there could relate to. The Lady of Ravenna cared everything for her city, but nothing for those that actually lived in it. She paid them no attention, paid them no mind until she needed them for something, and then she ground them up. She fed them to the massive, unwieldy, contracting, dying beast that was Ravenna, and she promptly forgot about them once again. Ho's gambit, it paid off. He was surrounded by friendly, understanding ears, by men and women who didn't just sympathize, but empathized with him and his plight. Ho firmly believed that you could judge the quality of a tale, and he who wove it by how many drinks he was offered afterward. And Ho now had enough wine in front of him to get actually drunk, to finally fall into the ecstasy, of intoxication. But his task wasn't finished yet. He dumped another goblet down his gullet. He had long before lost track of how many he'd had. And he listened, smiling, as those around him began to tell their own sad tales, their own stories of how the Lady of Ravenna had used and left them, how Ravenna had discarded them, abandoned them. The pump was primed. His audience was ready, and he, with his vision blurring and the colors far brighter, far more saturated than they were before, he was ready. So he spoke. He gave voice to the feeling that everyone in that tavern had, the one they felt growing and churning in the pit of their stomachs, the one that they themselves were too scared to speak aloud. He pounded another glass of wine. He uncrossed his eyes and he cried out, letting loose a mangled version of the phrase that Caleria herself had taught to him, that damnable refrain that filled every decent citizen of Ravenna with dread. "Where is this Vermin Prince, then? I'm through eating scraps." Though he was drunk, his delivery had been heavily calculated. Joking enough for those made uncomfortable by it, made uneasy by the very mention of the Vermin Prince, but still humorous enough that they could simply laugh it off. Most of his audience, that's exactly what they did. Some, of course, were too squeamish, and they either quickly excused themselves from the bar or, in some cases, even tried to cut Ho off. But they were in the minority, because the rest of his audience, they could see the humor and the truth in his statement, and several of them, disgusted by their fellows' efforts to silence Ho, he who had so expertly voiced their own frustrations, they ordered additional rounds of drinks, the better to toast Ho and urge him onward in his tirades. But Ho and his tirades, they were finished. Not because Ho was too drunk, though he was awfully, terribly drunk, but because there was nothing else he needed to say. He had laid his trap. He had set it expertly, establishing his martial bona fides, talking of how the proctors feared him, and more importantly, his teachings. He had proven through his sad history, one easily verified by anyone old enough to remember Ravenna's revered 7 masters, he had proven that there was no love lost between himself and Caleria. And most importantly, he had invoked the name of that enigmatic figure, that gutter-born royalty, the Vermin Prince. All Ho had to do now was to wait and drink, to drink and wait until his audience had drifted away, to crawl back to their shanties and shacks, or simply to fall asleep, face down at the bar or a table. To wait until the barmaid, irritated that he still tried to get more wine for the pendant he had offered her, started urging him to leave, as she did with all the other drunken indigents. To wait until a single, filthy figure, more squalid and reeking than even himself, sidled over to him. She had sat in the darkness, unassuming, inconspicuous, so unremarkable that he'd failed to even notice her until that moment. Until the moment that she turned to him, brushing aside her greasy hair, full of knots, dirt, and who knew what else, until she, eyebrows lowered, gazed directly into Ho's glassy but still glowing green eyes, and spoke. "So you wish to pay homage to the Vermin Prince?" Ho grinned stupidly, using his drunkenness to mask his glee and the pride he had in a plan well executed.
"I'm afraid I'm a little..."
Ho hiccuped, and he lied to the woman's face.
"I'm broke. I have nothing to pay anyone."
The woman smiled wickedly. That shouldn't be a problem. Everyone has something that someone else needs. She turned, walking quickly to the door as she spoke over her shoulder. "Come on, then." Ho no longer needed to feign his stumbling, halting walk, the one that sent him careening through the tavern after this foul-looking creature. He shuffled after her, but he took special care not to rattle the copious amounts of coins he still held upon his person. As drunk as he was, with his legs turned to jelly, he struggled to keep pace with that aged urchin, she that clung to the shadows and peeked around corners as she led him through the winding streets of Ravena's most destitute quarters. As they entered a darkened alley at the end of a darkened street, flanked by two darkened buildings, Ho began to speak, slurring and panting. Where are you leading me?" He paused to suck air in through his mouth.
"Is this where the Vermin Prince reigns?"
The filthy, greasy creature turned to face him, that wicked smile flashing in her face once again. But it wasn't the only thing in that alley that reflected the light, because as she turned, she produced from her rags a long, twisting, evil dagger. "The Vermin Prince reigns everywhere, but you must pay to see him." Ho, paying little mind to the woman or her dagger, staggered over to the nearest wall, placed his hand upon it, and bent slightly, resting as he fought to fill his spasming lungs with air.
"I told you, I have nothing."
"Lies!" the woman shouted, furious. "I saw what you gave the barmaid, what you handed off to her." She shook her head, anger boiling up within her. "You could have fenced it for far, far more than 4 glasses of wine." Ho scrunched up his face and looked at her, confused.
"A fence? But that's for stolen goods, right?"
He tried to warm her with a goofy, drunken smile.
"The only things I'd steal are hearts."
"Lies. Again." She began to stalk toward him. "You think I'm as dumb as you are, old man. If the pendant was yours, then you must have more. And if it wasn't," she grins, "you know where to get more." Ho, having caught his breath, straightened himself, placing his hands upon his low back as he stretched his taut, exhausted muscles. I told you, I have nothing to offer the Vermin Prince but my allegiance. She snarled her response. The Vermin Prince can go to hell, and you can join him after you give me whatever's in your pockets. Ho allowed his eyes to focus. He brought his slurring speech under control, his voice taking on a different tone as he addressed the approaching mugger. You can try and take it, but you won't like what it costs you. He'd expected for her to speak again, expected to see her struggle to decide whether attacking the old man before her was worth the risk, worth the chance that he wasn't as helpless as he had at first seemed. But she was clearly too taken by rage, by desperation, by resentment, by hunger. With a shocking speed, she sprang toward him, her blade dancing through the air. But as she lunged forward, all of her street-honed reflexes, all of her cutthroat speed, it amounted to naught, because for Ho, she slowed to a crawl. The entire world around him slowed to a crawl as he spun in a half circle and crouched slightly, allowing his attacker's momentum to drive her stomach directly into his waiting hip. It was enough to stun her, but not enough to stop her as she changed her grip on her dagger and made to bring it down upon Ho's throat. Normally, he would have played with her as he had Gonith. He would have educated her on the grace and power of his peerless technique. He would have showed her each of its 8 arms. He would have teased her with distracting strike after distracting strike, only to finish her off with a deceptively, comically simple mercy blow. A knee to the gut, a palm to the nose, a head to the sternum. But he wasn't in the mood. Ho resented being on this errand in the first place, resented the fact that he was little more than a proctor out of uniform, subject to the whims and commands of that awful witch. So he had no desire to waste time here when he could be back in Ravena's finer quarters, spending some of his well-earned coin on a finer grade of wine that wouldn't ravage his stomach the next morning. No, he had no time to waste and no desire to waste time he didn't have. So as the woman brought the knife down, he bunched up his fist in the peculiar fashion of his now defunct school, with the knuckles of his first and second fingers slightly extended, slightly exposed, and then, in a flash of violence, one that he regretfully took far, far too much pleasure in, he shot his fist up, driving his knuckles directly into his attacker's throat. As she writhed upon the ground, gasping for air, trying to will her wounded windpipe to open back up, to feed her spasming lungs with the air they needed, he stooped down and picked up the woman's dagger. It was a simple, crude weapon, one that he hated to sully his hands with. While he had no plans to use the blade, he also had no intentions of finding it buried in his back. As he wrapped it in his rags, making sure to cover and protect its nasty, hateful, serrated edges. A voice spoke to him from the darkness. Very good. The Vermin Prince hates seeing anything or anyone go to waste. Ho looked up with a start, convinced that he knew what spoke to him from the darkness, terrified that what awaited him was Yardoon and his tribe, there to take from him whether they were owed or not. But when he gazed into that darkened corner, he didn't see the red eyes, didn't see the furry head, didn't see the unnatural limbs, or even the monster's gleaming smile. No. What he saw was child. A sad, waifish orphan, so small, so thin, so dirty, with hair so long and tangled that he couldn't even determine whether it was a girl or a boy. And he, or she, it, crouched there, having emerged from who knows where, staring holes in him with eyes that exuded something small, beaten, and bestial. Ho, rattled by the child's sudden appearance, spoke haltingly. Do you serve the Vermin Prince? The child allowed its face to soften with a quick, gentle smile, but spoke with venom in its voice. I do, and I am no longer content with scraps. And with that, the child turned and began to dig frantically, with amazing speed and power, in the filth, the garbage, the ordure, and the detritus that filled the alleyway. What are you doing? Ho approached slowly, cautiously, keeping one eye on the mugger as she struggled to her feet and staggered out of the alleyway. I'm taking you to him. But I warn you, the waif, having cleared a man-sized hole in the filth, turned back and faced Ho once again with those beady eyes. The path to freedom is an arduous one. Before Ho could say or do anything, the child leapt face first into the hole and quickly disappeared into the darkness. Puzzled, Ho crept up to the hole, but was immediately pushed back by the creeping stench that emanated from it, coming from the unnatural, fetid depths of that darkened tunnel. But with the mission laid out for him, with no desire to waste any time, with anywhere decent to drink already closed for the night, with his life's work shattered, with his life rendered meaningless, what difference did it make? What difference did anything make? So Ho took a deep breath. He pinched his nose, and he climbed in to the hole. He lost his breath almost immediately. Not just from the overpowering odor, but from the speed at which he tumbled through the filth and the darkness. He fell for what felt like ages, for a length of time that, knowing what he did about Ravenna and its ancient, poorly maintained sewers, was impossibly long. he fell through pitch-black tunnels of unknown design, origin, and destination, tumbling head over heels at increasing speeds, feeling filth and garbage knock loose from the walls as he brushed against them, as he smashed into them, dislodging themselves and joining him in his descent. He fell for ages. He fell for an eternity. He fell for so long that he felt as if his drunkenness, as if the ecstasy of intoxication would leave him, as if it had left him. He fell and he fell. He fell forever. Until he didn't. Until he stopped. Until he looked up to find himself, the tunnels of filth gone missing, to find himself laying upon a pile of garbage, a heap of that which ravenous citizens had discarded, abandoned in a stone cavern lit by strange veins of crystal that glowed just enough to illuminate Ho's surroundings. The child, the waif, was gone. He, she, whatever that strange child was, had disappeared. But Ho was not alone. He was far from alone, though he would have very much wished that to be the case. Because what stood before him, what squatted upon the earth in that glowing cavern, was something he would have preferred left to his nightmares, the ones that assailed him on nights when he had too much or too little to drink. At first, Ho thought that he was too drunk, and then that he was too sober. But then he realized the truth, the shocking, horrifying truth. He realized that the ponderous form squatting before him, hissing and spitting in unnatural rhythms, that it was real. It was not a nightmare. It was not a hallucination. And as Ho forced himself to his feet, unwilling to meet his doom while laying in a pile of garbage, he watched the creature's bloated form, watched its pendulous rolls of fat dangle and quiver as it forced itself up upon a pair of spindly legs tipped with blackened claws that dug deep into the filth. And as it stood, as it rose, airing out those foul folds of flesh, Ho was hit by a wave of stench so potent that it singed his nose hairs, causing him to gag reflexively as he realized that this repellent detestation was the source of the terrible smell that had clawed its way through those tunnels of filth all the way to the surface world. Ho took to his feet, angling for position, but held in rapt horror by the abhorrent beast that stood before him, stretching out its long, skeletal arms and spreading a pair of bat wings that grew out of its pale, gangrenous flesh. And as he watched, the monster began to speak. Or, rather, it tried to speak through a mouth so full of tiny, sharpened rat teeth that they cut through the beast's cheeks as it moved its jowls. Its speech was unintelligible, meaningless, but within it, Ho could sense the bile and the venom that dripped as heavily as the thick, gray, glistening saliva that hung heavy from the monster's maw. Swaying, beginning to reacquaint himself with the unknowable anti-rhythms he relied upon, the unpredictable spinning of the eight-armed star, Ho began to recognize something in the monster's groaning, something in its cadence, in its arrogant, thinly veiled hatred. And he began to see something familiar, Something he had known for years, saw it lurking deep within the fiend's corpulent form, as suddenly, flapping its useless bat wings as it ran, the horror rushed toward him. Ho was just barely quick enough, falling and rolling to his left with so little time to spare that he felt the monster's leg brush up against the baggy rags that he had cloaked himself in. Rolling into a seated position, his legs crossed, Ho leaned his head back upon that lolling neck, gazing upon the beast from an upturned vantage. And as a besotted grin spread across his face, he spoke. Hung, I should have known you by the smell. Thanks for checking out this, SKALD's best episode yet. Already, hundreds of you have taken a few minutes out of your extremely busy days, maybe while listening to the newest SKALD, and you've left the show a glowing review. On iTunes, on Google Play, on Stitcher, or even for one of the Amazon volumes. Reviews aren't just helpful, they are crucial. They are essential to SKALD's continued growth. But here's the thing. While there are currently hundreds of reviews, SKALD has thousands of listeners. So please, help SKALD out in a way that costs you absolutely nothing but a few moments of your time. Go to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or Amazon and leave a review for the only story that matters. If it's a good one, I'll read it on an upcoming episode of the show. I need your reviews, but I also need something else. Your financial support. Not to cover the costs of hosting SKALD. Thankfully, current pledges already do that. But instead, to account for the amount of time and effort that goes into producing a brand new episode of this show each and every week. I know that every episode of SKALD is as good as any television, any movie, any comic, maybe even better. But unfortunately, it doesn't pay anywhere near as well. Help me keep producing this show for you each and every week by pledging a few dollars a month at patreon.com/SKALD. As always, please tell everyone you know online and in real life about SKALD. And if you ever want to chat with me about it, or maybe tag me in some of your effusive praise, I'm Aubrey Sitterson on all social media. Or just hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything I've got going on. This week's recommendation is the newest album from the band Nails. It's called You Will Never Be One of Us. Nails has gotten a lot of heat lately in certain quarters, but their aggressive, pounding take on the power violence subgenre is gloriously cathartic. Great for doing cardio and pumping iron, or even writing strange, brutal, weird sword and sorcery fiction. Check it out today and make sure that you play it loud. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.